Hi guys, welcome to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Kyra, and here on this channel we are all about real makeup for real life and real people. Last week I did rank my top 10 colorful palettes in my collection. As I mentioned in that video, I have 80 some eyeshadow palettes, and I just think it would be kind of an impossible feat to rank them all. It would be an oddly long video, and I just decided to do it this way. So last week we ranked colorful palettes. This week I am ranking my neutral palettes, the top 10 neutral palettes in my collection. And at some point, I will rank all of the palettes that I purchased in 2021, so stay tuned for that. This was actually harder than ranking my favorite colorful palettes, if I'm being honest, which is so interesting. But I love all of these palettes. They all serve sort of a different purpose within my collection. So let's go ahead and start with number 10. Number 10 is my Colourpop Going Coconuts palette. Yes, this is a surprise to me for it to fall down at number 10 as well, but them's the breaks. I have a lot of beautiful neutral palettes in my collection, and honestly, I have a lot of palettes that kind of fall in between neutral and colorful, but I did really try to stick to the neutral tones today. This is beautiful. I feel like it has all of the neutral mattes that I would need. A nice blending shade, something a little rosy, something neutral, warm, etc. Plus 3 beautiful shimmers, especially this one is so beautiful and shiny. To me, this is like the perfect lid shade in my collection. But this one falls at number 10 just because it's kind of been knocked down peg by peg by some other palettes that I love just a little bit more. Number 9 is probably the least neutral palette in this ranking, and it is the Nomad palette from Juvia's Place. This was the very first palette that I purchased this year. I believe I purchased this with points around my birthday, and yes, there is some color in here. I think if you just cover up the Big Bird yellow or even the 2 yellows here, you have a very neutral palette, and I think it is so beautiful. Not to mention one of the most beautiful lid shades in my collection. It's champagne-y, it's gold, but it's got a little bit of a worn or a weathered feel to the tone. Love this palette. I can get a lot of different looks out of here. The mattes are actually quite beautiful, including the yellows, but it's just a great palette. I'm glad I got my hands on it this year. Number 8 is a Quint, and it is my Natasha Denona Mini Glam palette. I love this. I love this for overnights. I love this for traveling when I get the chance, which of course is not as much over the last couple of years, but it has 2 wonderful mattes in here. Actually, this one I think is one of her creamed powder mattes. It's the shade Harlow, and then you have a really nice basic deepening brown shade that could be, you know, diffused in the crease as well as used to deepen the outer corner, used as a liner, etc. But then you have 3 really beautiful metallic shades as well that just, when paired together in different ways, they really make this palette. I feel like this palette is a lot more versatile than it would seem, especially with only 5 shades. But I do really love this one. I think it's really great. Next in my ranking at number 7 is the Colourpop Off Melrose palette. I really like this. In fact, I like this even more than I ever thought I would. And it really is quite a neutral palette. Now I will say mine looks different than how it came. Right here was a pressed glitter shade, and I am not into the Colourpop pressed glitters, so I did remove the glitter and just put another single Colourpop shadow that I have, probably from a discontinued palette. I am currently working on panning this shade and this shade, so I had to pop them back in here real quickly. But this is a nice neutral palette with some interesting tones that help add a little bit more interest than some neutral palettes. You have a duochrome right here, you have a nice green down here, you have a nice copper up here. So not your everyday neutral kind of shades, but when paired with the neutral parts, the mattes, and the other more neutral shimmers, it still comes off as neutral, but not boring. Number 6 is a palette that I worked on panning earlier this year, and I did hit pan in one shade, and that is my Anastasia Beverly Hills Soft Glam palette. This has just always been one of my favorite neutral palettes since it came into my collection. These are my type of neutral shades. These are the things that I reach for. You know, these soft peachy oranges, warm browns, you got a cooler brown and a black, which always adds versatility to a palette. You've got a nice cream shade, you've got some really nice shimmers in here. I'm not a big fan of the one called bronze right here, but that's just a personal preference. The rest of these I love and use regularly. Nothing wrong ever with a Dusty Rose matte. Just love this. I can put it all over the lid, buff it up into the crease, and be very happy with the look. I did hit pan earlier this year on the shade Rose Pink, but I also really love this shade Sultry right here. In fact, the shade Sultry in this palette is like the exact same shade as the actual Sultry palette packaging, which I thought was interesting. So yeah, I love this palette. It's been a favorite since I've owned it, and I've owned it, I'm pretty sure, since its release. So yeah, I really enjoy this. Wouldn't mind working on some more shades in here next year. Raise your hands down in the comments how many of you knew that I would have my Persona Identity palette in this ranking. Of course you did. Did you think, though, that it would be ranked all the way down at number 5? Because I find that really interesting personally. This has been a number 1 palette for me for years. I've gotten a ton of use out of it. It still holds some of my very favorite shades in my collection. I love this sort of dusty plum shade. Love the shade Bombshell. And then I did earlier this year hit pan on the shade Seductive. They're just beautiful. And the thing I really love about this palette is the texture of the shimmers. The texture of the shimmers is very soft, very buttery, very similar to some ABH shadows, but even more similar to the Lorac shimmer shadow formula, at least in the older Pro palettes. So it's very smoothing on the eyes, very forgiving, flattering, and all of those things. And overall, this is just a wonderful day-to-day collection of colors that I tend to get a lot of use out of. So what could have possibly beat out my precious Persona palette? Well, coming in at number 4 is the Natasha Denona Bronze palette. I've gotten a lot of use out of this palette this year. I've used it in custom eyeshadow palettes that I've created. I've used this while duping certain palettes out of my collection, and I've used it just alone by itself. It's got some beautiful shades in here. I've always said that I really love the addition of these cool tone shades down here. I love personally mixing warm tones and cool tones together. I think it adds so much beauty and interest to the eye look. So I love including these two shades in the looks, but we have some beautiful duochromes, and the mattes are just stunning. One of my favorite mattes, if not my favorite matte from Natasha Denona altogether, is this shade right here, which is Suntan. Sort of a beautiful rosy terracotta shade, and I am just a sucker for a shade like that. I need to look in my collection and see if I have a blush like that, because I could get down with that. So love this. Love the addition of this also cream to powder shade, this dark blue here called Deep Dive. It works beautiful as an eyeshadow, but it also works really beautifully as a cool tone indigo liner with any look she might create with this palette. So I really enjoy this one. I'm actually surprised, to be honest, how much I enjoy this one. I love warm tones, but I don't always tend to gravitate toward them, if it makes sense, but they look really nice. And speaking of palettes that shocked me in terms of how much I really learned to love it, is my Colourpop That's Taupe palette. I bought this at the end of 2020, and I just love this thing. I have used this a ton. I did multiple looks with this palette, and any of these palettes where I have multiple look videos, I will link those down below in case you want to see these shades or palettes in action. This one is so cool though. It has a rosy tone up here. This is definitely a favorite matte in my collection. It's the shade Python, and it's like a rosy taupe color that is just beautiful. I love, again, it as a one eyeshadow look, and I've never been big on all matte eyeshadow looks, but this year I've learned to love them. And then again, this shade right here, just like the center of the Going Coconuts palette, look at that. It's like liquid metal. You also have this one down here, which leans very green. So this had a lot of surprising aspects to me. And I love this thing. When Ali Glines put out a bundle with Colourpop, it included this palette, and I can absolutely see why. If I had to make a bundle tomorrow with Colourpop, I would probably include this palette because it is one of my all-time favorites from Colourpop. Number 2, yet another Natasha Denona palette. It is the GLAM palette. And this one I just love. I never ever reach into this palette and pull out a look that I don't like. I think it has all the staple neutrals in here in terms of mattes, as well as different levels of shine, pigment, warm tones, cool tones, pink, gold. It has it all in here, deepening shades, outer lid shades. You can go smoky, you can go everyday, work appropriate, school appropriate. You could just use mattes in here. I mean, the options are sort of endless. And while I know a lot of people didn't like how she named the shades in here, you can move things around if that's better for you, or you can just use them however you want. I really love this deep brown, sort of satiny shimmer shade down here. It's so rich and beautiful, and I think it would just be a wonderful base all over the lid for a really smoky, sultry look with something a little lighter highlighting the center of the lid. So I love this one. It's number 2 because I get a ton of use out of it, and I'm very happy to have it. And lastly, number 1 in my top 10 neutral palettes is, any guesses? Any guesses? Natasha Denona Biba. I know this video was a little Natasha Denona heavy, like 4 palettes from Natasha Denona in here, but it really is my favorite eyeshadow palette, and I'm not going to BS you guys on my actual top 10 palettes just for the sake of having, you know, a multitude of brands to share with you, but I do love this thing. And I will say that Alter Ego, which I will link down below, has a wonderful dupe version of this palette called the, put it on the screen here, I decluttered it to my girl Angela because I wanted her to try it. But Alter Ego does a lot of Natasha Denona dupes, and they do it very well. So if this is just like way out of your price range, or you could never imagine spending over $100 for a palette, I understand that. I recommend the Alter Ego one. I personally used it myself and really loved it, and then I got this as a gift. So one thing I love about this is, again, you have quite a few of the cream to powder shadows. That is my favorite formula from Natasha Denona, but you also get some of her regular creamy matte shadows and the 3 most perfect shimmer shades that you could need out of a palette. You have a nice brownie bronze, a beautiful gold, and a slightly pinky leaning champagne. I mean, I just don't need any more shimmers than that. This covers the gamut from everyday light wearable to smoky date night party time, which who knows what that is anymore. Another one of my absolute favorite shades in here is this cream to powder shade called Tone. It's just a really beautiful, again, sort of rosy, maybe a little peachy terracotta shade, a little bit grayed out, and it's just stunning. I just think It's like the perfect transition shade. It would be a great one shadow look. I just can't sing the praises of this palette enough. I believe it's one that I will be using and abusing for a long time to come. And hopefully my crazy eyeshadow project pan next year will help me do that. So that is what I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed today's ranking. Were there any surprises for you? For me, I really was personally surprised about where the Persona Identity palette fell for me. And I'll tell you how I rank my things. I picked 10, my top 10, like these are my top 10. I put them out on my desk here, and then one by one I take it away. So okay, if I had to give away one palette out of this group, the first one I would allow to be taken from me would be number 10, which is, you know, Going Coconuts. And then I just kind of work my way through that way all the way up to number 1. So sometimes the results are actually surprising to me too. And I was quite surprised on how far down, about halfway down, Persona Identity was. And I was also kind of surprised at how far up the That's Taupe palette from Colourpop was. I know I love that palette, but I didn't know I loved it more than Persona at this point in time. This was, as always, a fun exercise within my collection to just learn more about myself, my preferences, and my makeup usage. So again, I hope you enjoyed. If you did find today's video helpful or entertaining in some way, I hope you'll give it a thumbs up and maybe consider subscribing before you leave. That way we can see each other again in my next video, and I hope all of your makeup days are absolutely beautiful makeup days.